Hey everyone, mid-February, the month's been very quiet for the Moon to Mars programs, the NASA managed programs under the Artemis sort of branding umbrella. The commercial lunar missions are commercial lunar missions, so those are managed by, the launch this week. That's Intuitive Machines. That's the spacecraft. SpaceX managed the launch services. So definitely keeping an eye on that, but there's a lot of reporting about that outside of here. So staying focused on the Moon to Mars program. So we got some pictures this week. So we'll go ahead and go through those. There's a few tidbits to go through, and I'll also pick up a couple of odds and ends. It's now getting close to 6 weeks since NASA announced the double delay of Artemis II and III. There remains a lot of uncertainty about the overall situation, other than that the launch dates were pushed back almost a year to September 2025 and 2026, respectively. A very short period of time was allocated for questions in the January 9th audio conference, so I'm still trying to get a better understanding of the situation, the issues, the road to resolution, reorganizing the schedule, and more. We got an update from Exploration Ground Systems at the end of January about their Artemis II status, and that was published on NASAspaceflight.com early this month. But the schedule will be driven by the flight hardware, and the current status for Orion and SLS is even less clear. So the waiting continues for that, and in the meantime I started working on some reference videos. So far, February has been a quiet month for updates. However, we did get a couple of notes about spacecraft and launch vehicle status in the last week, and the EGS, Orion, and SLS programs also published pictures. One thing to note programmatically is about Gateway Logistics Services. About this time last year, so February 2023-ish, it was noted in a story by Jeff Faust for Space News that authority to proceed was finally expected during the year. SpaceX had been awarded the first contract to develop and build its Dragon XL spacecraft for the first logistics mission to Gateway. That was way back in March 2020, but due to delays in the Artemis manifest, ATP, which includes the critical funding to begin post-study work, had never been granted. ATP and funding finally came through in November of last year. You can see on this slide the $86 million contract modification that accompanied the ATP. Below it is a statement from NASA Public Affairs that was released just before Thanksgiving. NASA's FY24 budget included Gateway Logistics Services funding for the first deep space logistics mission, which was fully executed on November 3, 2023. This incremental funding enables NASA and its first Gateway Logistics Services vendor, SpaceX, to begin work that aligns with the agency's Artemis schedule. The first Artemis mission to Gateway is Artemis IV, which would be no earlier than September 2028. The initial Gateway elements would need to get to the near rectilinear halo orbit first, and that launch date is under review, but is not likely before 2026. It will take a year for the power and propulsion element to spiral itself and the habitations and logistics outpost out to NRHO, which would be sometime no earlier than 2027. And the Gateway, the Dragon XL logistics mission to Gateway would be sometime after the initial elements reach NRHO, but ahead of the Artemis IV launch. So this week was a picture dump week. But we did get a couple of notes, either with the pictures or off to the side. So the first set of pictures that we got were from Orion. The program released a set of pictures taken inside the crew module and outside the service module in the middle of the week. The crew module pictures were released on social media, so it's not as clear when they were taken. However, the shots from the low bay of the fast cell, where the spacecraft is currently situated in the IOZ, which is the Industrial Operations Zone of the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building at Kennedy Space Center. And so these shots, the shots of the service module in the fast cell low bay, I'm calling it the low bay, were taken on February 1st. Actually, two of the shots were from inside the crew cabin from the social media set. This one is looking out towards the covered main windows of the spacecraft. Just in front of the main windows, also with covers on them, are the three primary crew displays. This is what they look like in one of the Orion simulators, with the pilot seats for reference. The other picture is basically turning to the left from the first one and looking towards or out the side hatch. Well, the hatchway itself, not the hatch, although I think the hatch is visible there on the left side of the hatchway. A third shot from the social media post on February 13th is from out in the IOZ area, showing one of the backshell panels that goes over the main window, already covered with the silver tape that is used for thermal and electrostatic discharge protection. This provides some indication of how close the Lockheed Martin ATLO team, ATLO stands for Assembly, Test, and Launch Operations, but this provides some indication of how close the team was getting to the vacuum test before the issues that we heard about, since this panel looks like it was nearly ready for installation ahead of the vacuum test. That was tentatively forecast for somewhere early in the year, on the old schedule anyway, before the delay and the issues were announced. Unfortunately, we're still trying to get more background on these issues since the first and only briefing on them on January 9th. Hopefully there will be some availability in the next several weeks, but we did get one little tidbit in the social media post saying that the vacuum test was now in the spring. That's a little vague since it could be anywhere from late March to late June, but it is news. If that target time frame is verified, it is an indication that they are hoping to resolve the Orion issues with the heat shield, motor drive circuitry, and battery performance by the middle of the year, which would allow them to get into the vacuum test and then maybe a few months of closeouts, followed by handover to EGS sometime in the second half of the year. Realistically, in order to support the current September 2025 target date, Orion would need to be in the hands of EGS, figuratively, before the end of this year. That would provide some margin for the 8 months or so of work that EGS estimated they would need to complete Orion launch preps after production is complete. On Thursday, February 15th, a couple of shots of the service module taken from around the low bay of the fast cell were published, showing the addition of the NASA and European Space Agency logos to the spacecraft. The logos were added to one of the aft-facing crew module adapter panels, or walls. These shots are from a relatively rare point of view, at least in public. The crew module adapter and European service module together form the Orion service module. The crew and service modules were mated back in mid-October, with the crew module being moved over, lifted, and placed on top of the service module that had already been situated in the fast cell. In these pictures, platforms are extended around one of the upper levels to provide access to the crew module, but they also block the view of it from this vantage point. These pictures of the spacecraft below the crew module show not just the service module, but the spacecraft adapter cone below that. The SA cone helps to connect Orion to its launch vehicle. For both of its first two flight tests, it was attached to a Delta upper stage, or SLS derivative, the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. We can also see that the outboard walls/panels for the CMA are not yet attached, since internal access to the CMA is still required or desired. Then on Friday, February 16th, there was a double picture dump from EGS first and then SLS. EGS released a set of pictures taken back on January 30th of work done in the RPSF rotation building to add the NASA worm logo to the left-hand and right-hand center SRB segments. One of the things that immediately jumped out in viewing the images was that the logo was being painted in a different location on the circumference of the segments. On the first set of boosters for Artemis I, the logo was positioned over the systems tunnel, so it was painted in two phases. Part in the RPSF, the Rotation, Processing, and Surge Facility, part in the RPSF after the motor segments were shipped from Promontory, Utah, and prior to the beginning of booster stacking, and then the other part in the VAB months later when the boosters were being closed out for the first vehicle rollout to Launch Pad 39B. I had interviewed Cliff Lanham in late January about where EGS is with some of its Artemis II preparations. He is the Senior Vehicle Operations Manager for EGS, and that's covered in detail in the story published on NSF on February 3rd. Mr. Lanham had said that the RPSF team was prepping the center segments for this paint job, but I had assumed the location would be the same and had not asked if that was the case. The pictures released on Friday show that that was a bad assumption. In the newer location, the worm logo is positioned more towards the +Z or 0 degree side of the vehicle. It does not touch the systems tunnel, and the paint job can be completely finished in the RPSF. This will be something to follow up on to see if the location will change again for Artemis III or if this was a lessons learned from Artemis I. This is a render provided by NASA Public Affairs of what the logo will look like on the vehicle, big picture, in its new position. We're looking at the 0 degree side of the vehicle and comparing to similar views from Artemis I, we can see the relative location of the mobile launcher tower. It was difficult to see the worm logo on the Artemis I vehicle from cameras on the ML tower, and now it appears they would be completely out of view from those OTV positions. In contrast, it should make the worm logo a little easier to see from the KSC press site. Here's a side-by-side compare and contrast of the logo placement on Artemis I and Artemis II, from what looks like the left-hand center segments to the right-hand segments. Going back to the Artemis I configuration, this is a side-by-side comparison from different angles of what the logo looked like on the booster, on the right-hand booster, after SLS was stacked. On the left, we can see the exposed systems tunnel wire harnesses for operational instrumentation and command and control, and also for development flight instrumentation. On the right, the cover plates and other thermal protection system coverings are installed now with the rest of the worm logo painted over them. As noted, the new placement of the Artemis II center segments means the painting of the logo can be finished in the RPSF now before booster stacking begins. It's still uncertain when that booster stacking will begin. In the story I wrote for NSF, based on interviewing Mr. Lanham, EGS is working towards completing the mobile launcher testing out at Pad 39B and rolling back to the VAB for stacking preps by the end of the spring. But even if EGS Integrated Operations is ready to begin stacking the vehicle by the middle of the year, it remains uncertain when that will actually happen. I still have that list of watch items, and it's likely that another milestone is the critical path and will drive the schedule. Following closely on the heels of publication of the pictures from the RPSF, the SLS program released a set of pictures taken back on February 1st at the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans. These are showing a significant milestone in production of Core Stage 3, which will fly on the Artemis III mission. The liquid oxygen tank was finally removed from the Vertical Assembly Center in Building 110 at MAF, now going on a year and a half after the initial pieces were loaded for welding. The tank was moved from the VAC to the adjacent Cell D in Building 110, where the next step was partial installation of the baffle assembly in the bottom of the tank. The Core Stage LOX tank consists of 4 structural elements: a forward dome, 2 barrels, and an aft dome. The forward dome and the first barrel were loaded into the VAC in August 2022, basically a year and a half ago, and the welding of the first 3 elements was complete in the fall of 2022. That was when issues were discovered while trying to weld an aft dome for the tank on tools on the other side of the factory. The root cause corrective actions process for those issues with the dome welding tools ran through the rest of 2022 and almost all of 2023 before an aft dome was completed and prepared for welding to the rest of the tank in December of 2023. The final weld in the VAC was completed on January 8th, and these pictures show the move from the VAC to Cell D on February 1st. Following the first part of the baffle assembly installation in Cell D, the tank will be lifted out of the cell, rotated to horizontal, placed on a pair of rotation, assembly, and transportation tools, or RATs, and moved into another area of the SLS production facilities. The next step in production is plug welding of the circumferential VAC welds. The tank will then move on to proof testing and weld inspections. Following that, it will move into the primer and foam spray booths in nearby Building 131, those being cell P for primer and cell N for spray on foam insulation. The Artemis III schedule changed with a nearly year-long delay in the target launch date from the end of 2025 to September of 2026 now, but we haven't got an update on interim milestones such as the new need date for this unit, Core Stage 3. The need date would be aligned with completion, and on the previous schedule, NASA had said that this unit would be complete in early 2025. Now the question after the delay is whether it can be completed sometime within the 2025 calendar year. The status of the Artemis II Core Stage has been unclear going back to that Thanksgiving timeframe. Core Stage 2 had started integrated functional testing in early October, and the last detailed update goes back to before the holidays at the end of 2023. We finally got word this past week that Final Integrated Functional Test, or FIFT, was completed on January 23rd, or some 3 weeks ago. It's still not clear what that means because we also found out last week that delivery of the stage from Michoud to Kennedy Space Center was delayed until no earlier than this summer. New Marshall Space Flight Center Director Joseph Pelfrey noted that in a news conference at the Space Center in Huntsville, Alabama on February 15th.
And later this summer, we're excited to roll out the core stage for Artemis II to get it ready to ship to the Kennedy Space Center to begin stacking for that mission.
For the first core stage, SLS was in a hurry because it was critical path for Artemis I, so there were no plans to take a breath when FIFT was completed for core stage 1. They went straight into delivery preparations. This time, due to the most recently announced delays, delivery is at least 4 months away. So it's not clear whether completion of FIFT this time means the stage will remain in a test and checkout configuration with the internal platforms remaining in place, or the break of configuration was a part of what was called the completion of FIFT. What is relatively clear is that New Orleans is a better place to park the stage than the VAB transfer aisle, at least for now. Although the stage is not necessarily complete, passing FIFT means it's a working rocket stage now. There should only be a few weeks of TPS detailing and closeouts to perform ahead of shipment, and then after arrival at KSC and handover to EGS, another few weeks of stacking preps in the vehicle assembly building. Between now and then, there was some discussion of performing maintenance on the agency's Pegasus barge, which will be used to transport the core stage from Michoud to Kennedy Space Center. And that maintenance perhaps had been scheduled for after transportation of the stage, but now with the delays, it's possible that they looked for the best possible place to do that maintenance. But that could also have schedule implications for shipment of SLS hardware, not just the core stage, but other SLS hardware for Artemis II, 3, and 4. So with these couple of updates on the near-term Artemis II schedule, looking at this watch items list again, we see that a spring vacuum test would mean some level of resolution to the Orion issues by that time, at least enough to pick up with the integrated functional testing of Orion. Orion still seems to be the critical path for Artemis II. For the EGS and SLS schedules, the most recent notes put the mobile launcher in the VAB around mid-year and maybe the core stage in the summer. Between now and then, we'll be looking to get a better fix on when Orion is ready for that big vacuum test. For Artemis III, it could be that Starship flight tests are the only milestones for a good part of this year. There's a lot of coverage of SpaceX development and test of Starship in South Texas elsewhere online, and it does sound like the third flight test schedule is a little less certain now, but that still looks to be where most of the Artemis III updates will be for a while. Hopefully we'll get a few more production updates for the Artemis III Orion and SLS hardware too. Thanks for watching another update video. We'll see what the next topic is. If there's enough news for another update, a production overview, or maybe something else.